For my sister's birthday, they rented a beach house, hired a chef, and invited all her friends. For mine, a store-bought muffin and a card that said, "Maybe next year." When I said nothing, my dad smirked, "Don't be so sensitive." I just took a photo of their gift and booked a flight. That night, my mom texted, "Where did you go?" I, 32M, never thought a single photograph would change everything. But sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest truths. The beach house photos were everywhere on social media. My sister's 28th birthday celebration looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Pristine white sand stretching endlessly, a private chef preparing elaborate seafood platters, her closest friends laughing around a bonfire that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The professional photographer they'd hired captured every perfect moment, every genuine smile, every carefully orchestrated detail of what my parents called a milestone birthday. 3 months later, I stood in our family kitchen staring at a gas station muffin with a single candle stuck in it. The frosting had already started to melt under the fluorescent lights, creating a sad puddle of artificial blue around the base. Next to it sat a generic birthday card, the kind you grab from the spinning rack when you realize you've forgotten something important. My mother handed me the card with what I can only describe as obligatory enthusiasm. Inside, someone had scrawled, "Maybe next year," in ballpoint pen. The ink had smudged slightly, as if even the pen didn't want to commit to the message. When I didn't immediately react with gratitude, my father looked up from his newspaper and delivered his verdict with that familiar smirk I'd grown to despise over the years. He told me not to be so sensitive, that birthdays weren't that important anyway, and that I should appreciate what I got instead of always comparing myself to Claire. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even let my expression change. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a careful photograph of the muffin and card, making sure the lighting captured every detail of their thoughtful gift. Then I excused myself, went upstairs, and booked the first flight I could find. The airport was surprisingly peaceful at 11 p.m. I sat in the departure lounge with my hastily packed bag, watching late-night travelers hurry past with their own urgent destinations. My phone buzzed constantly, text after text from my mother asking where I was, demanding explanations, growing increasingly frantic as the hours passed. I turned off my phone and boarded the plane to Denver. My college roommate Eli had moved there 5 years ago and had been begging me to visit ever since. He picked me up at the airport without asking a single question about why I'd suddenly appeared with no warning. That's the thing about real friends. They understand when you need space before you need explanations. For 3 days, I hiked through Rocky Mountain National Park, ate at food trucks, and slept on Eli's couch. I didn't check social media. I didn't answer calls. I just existed in a space where my worth wasn't measured against someone else's celebration. On the 4th day, Eli finally asked what had happened. I showed him the photograph of the muffin and card, then scrolled through Claire's beach house album. He stared at the images for a long time before asking if this was typical treatment in my family. I realized I'd never actually articulated it before. How every achievement of mine was met with polite acknowledgement while hers received parades. How my college graduation dinner was at a chain restaurant while hers was at the country club. How my promotion at work earned a brief congratulations, while her new apartment required a family celebration complete with champagne and catered appetizers. Eli suggested I stay in Denver permanently. He knew people in my field could help me find work, and his city felt like a place where I could build something entirely my own. The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Update 1. I'd been in Denver for 2 weeks when Claire called. She'd gotten my number from Eli somehow and wanted to know what my problem was. According to her, I was being dramatic and hurting our parents with my disappearing act. She reminded me that she'd never asked for special treatment, that our parents just wanted to celebrate her achievements, and that I was making everything about myself. I asked her if she remembered my 30th birthday 2 years ago. The silence stretched long enough that I knew she didn't. I reminded her that I'd spent it alone because everyone in the family was at her engagement party, an event scheduled for the same weekend that she'd known was my birthday. She told me that was different, that engagement parties were important milestones that couldn't be rescheduled. When I asked why my milestone birthdays never seemed to qualify for the same consideration, she got defensive and accused me of keeping score. Maybe I was keeping score. Maybe that's what happens when you spend 32 years watching the scales tip consistently in one direction. After we hung up, I walked through downtown Denver and realized something had shifted. The constant knot of resentment in my chest had loosened. Distance, it turned out, provided clarity I'd never had. While living in the middle of the dysfunction, I called Eli's friend Noah, who worked at a tech company downtown. We met for coffee, and by the end of the conversation, I had an interview scheduled for the following week. Update 2. The job offer came through on a Friday. Better salary, better benefits, and a signing bonus that would cover my relocation expenses. I accepted immediately, and gave my current employer 2 weeks' notice via email. That weekend, my father called. He'd heard from Claire that I was considering moving permanently and wanted to discuss my decision like adults. He flew to Denver without telling me, showing up at Eli's apartment with the kind of determined expression that meant he'd already decided how our conversation would end. We sat in a coffee shop near Eli's place, while he explained that I was overreacting to a simple misunderstanding. My parents loved me just as much as Claire, but she'd always been more vocal about her needs and better at planning celebrations. If I wanted bigger birthday parties, I should have asked for them instead of sulking when I didn't get them. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photograph again, the melting muffin, the generic card, the maybe next year message. Then I showed him the beach house photos from Claire's birthday. I asked him to explain the difference in effort, planning, and expense between these two celebrations. He studied the images for a moment before telling me that Claire's friends had helped plan her party, that it wasn't just my parents' doing, and that I couldn't expect the same level of celebration if I didn't put in the same effort to maintain relationships. I asked him who had been invited to plan my birthday celebration. The question hung in the air, unanswered. He shifted tactics, reminding me that family was more important than hurt feelings, that I was throwing away relationships over something trivial, and that I'd regret this decision when I was older and alone. I told him I'd already accepted the job offer. His expression changed then, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like respect. He asked if I was really willing to move across the country over a birthday cake, and I corrected him. It wasn't about the cake. It was about 32 years of being treated like an afterthought in my own family. He left Denver that evening without trying to change my mind. Update 3. Moving day arrived faster than I'd expected. Eli helped me load my belongings into a rental truck while I tried to process the surreal nature of starting over at 32. My phone had been quiet for days. No calls from my mother, no texts from Claire, no attempts at reconciliation from anyone. The silence felt both liberating and terrifying. My new apartment was small but bright, with windows that faced the mountains and neighbors who nodded politely. In the hallways, I spent my first week exploring the city, finding a grocery store, locating the nearest coffee shop, and learning the bus routes to my new office. On my second Saturday in Denver, I was unpacking books when my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I considered not answering. But curiosity won. She sounded tired when she asked how I was settling in. I told her about the apartment, the job, the mountains visible from my kitchen window. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. Then she said something that surprised me. She admitted that she'd been thinking about the birthday situation and realized they might have handled things poorly. She didn't apologize exactly, but she acknowledged that the difference in celebrations had been more significant than she'd initially recognized. I waited for the but that usually followed these partial admissions. Instead, she asked if I was happy in Denver. The question caught me off guard. When was the last time anyone in my family had asked if I was happy? I told her I was still adjusting, but that yes, I felt more content than I had in years. She was quiet for a long moment before telling me that my father had been unusually subdued since returning from Denver. Apparently, seeing the photographs side by side had affected him more than he'd admitted during our coffee shop conversation. I asked if she thought they'd treat things differently if I moved back home. She was honest enough to say she didn't know, but that she hoped they'd all learn something from this experience. I appreciated her honesty, but I also knew that hope wasn't enough to rebuild what had been broken. Over decades, 6 months later, Claire's engagement photos appeared on social media in the spring, and I felt nothing but mild curiosity about the elaborate staging and professional photography. The absence of resentment surprised me more than its presence ever had. I'd built a life in Denver that belonged entirely to me. Work colleagues who invited me to happy hours because they enjoyed my company, not out of obligation. Weekend hiking groups where my presence was welcomed rather than tolerated. A small circle of friends who remembered my birthday, without prompting, and celebrated it with genuine enthusiasm. My 33rd birthday fell on a Tuesday. My coworkers surprised me with a cake during lunch. Eli took me to a Rockies game that evening, and I ended the day feeling grateful for the unexpected path that had led me here. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother wishing me happy birthday. No generic card, no last-minute muffin, just a simple message acknowledging the day. It wasn't much, but it was more effort than they'd made in previous years. I texted back a simple thank you. Claire's wedding invitation arrived in June, addressed to me in Denver with a handwritten note asking if I'd consider attending. The ceremony was planned for October, and she hoped we could talk before then. I held the invitation for a long time, studying the elegant calligraphy and expensive cardstock. Part of me wanted to throw it away immediately, but a larger part recognized it as an olive branch extended across the distance I created. I RSVP'd yes, but booked a hotel room instead of staying with family. The wedding was beautiful in the way that expensive celebrations always are: perfect flowers, flawless photography, and a reception that would be talked about for years. I sat at a table with distant cousins and family friends, watching my parents beam with pride as they introduced their daughter and new son-in-law to everyone who would listen. During the reception, my father approached my table and asked if we could talk privately. We walked out to the hotel's garden, away from the music and laughter. He told me he'd been thinking about our conversation in Denver, about the photographs I'd shown him, about the patterns he'd never noticed until I'd pointed them out. He said he was proud of the life I'd built for myself, even if he wished I'd built it closer to home. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that's the best you can hope for from people who struggle to admit their mistakes. I told him I was glad I'd moved to Denver, that the distance had given me perspective I couldn't have gained while living in the middle of old patterns. He nodded and said he understood, even if he didn't like it. We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the mountains in the distance, before returning to the celebration. The next morning, I flew back to Denver with a strange sense of closure. I'd proven to myself that I could build a life worth living without waiting for others to recognize my worth. The validation I'd spent years seeking from my family had been replaced by something more valuable: self-respect earned through my own choices and actions. My phone buzzed as the plane lifted off. A text from Claire thanking me for coming to the wedding and asking if I'd be willing to visit for Christmas. She promised things would be different, that she'd make sure I felt included in family celebrations going forward. I stared out the airplane window at the landscape passing below and realized I no longer needed her promises. I'd already found what I was looking for, just not where I'd expected to find it. I texted back that I'd think about Christmas, but that Denver had become home now. Some distances, once created, become permanent not out of anger but out of growth. The plane banked toward the mountains, and I smiled at the sight of the city that had given me back myself.